A 19-inch waist sounds almost impossible today, but in the Victorian age, women were said to have waists that tiny. Some people even believe almost every wealthy woman looked like an hourglass. But was that actually true? Or have old photographs and paintings fooled us for more than 100 years? The answer is much more surprising than most people think. One of the most famous examples was Empress Elisabeth of Austria, better known as Empress Sisi. She became famous not only for her beauty but also for her incredibly small waist. It was said to measure around 19 inches for much of her adult life. Looking at her photographs, it almost seems impossible. But there was one important difference. Sisi was not an ordinary woman. She was obsessed with keeping her figure. She exercised constantly. She followed strict diets. She worked harder than almost anyone else to stay extremely slim. That made her the exception, not the rule. Most Victorian women wanted the same hourglass shape, but very few naturally had it. That is where the corset came in. Almost every fashionable woman wore one beneath her dress. The corset gently pulled in the waist, lifted the bust, and helped create the shape that was considered beautiful. Today, when people see old corsets in museums, they often think every woman had an incredibly tiny waist. But there is an important detail. Most corsets were not pulled completely close. They were usually laced with a gap at the back so they could fit comfortably around different body shapes. A corset that looked like it created a 20-inch waist could often be worn much more loosely. That means many real waist measurements were closer to 22 or 24 inches. In fact, that is exactly what many surviving Victorian dresses suggest. Museum collections around the world show that waist sizes in the low 20s were much more common than the famous 18 and 19 inches. The dresses also help create an illusion. Huge skirts made the waist appear much smaller than it really was. A fuller bust added to the same effect. It was clever fashion as much as natural shape. Girls also began wearing corsets from a young age. Families believed this would help train the body as they grew older. Over time, this could make the waist appear smaller. But even then, the tiny measurements we often hear about remained unusual. Then fashion changed again. By the late Victorian and early Edwardian years, women wanted an even slimmer shape. Princess Maud, the daughter of King Edward VII, and Queen Alexandra became famous for her remarkably small waist. Some reports claimed it measured only 18 inches. But there is another twist. Even the photographs cannot always be trusted. Long before computers existed, photographers were already altering images. They carefully scratched or retouched the glass negatives before printing the final picture. This made waists look even smaller than they really were. If you look closely at some original photographs, you can still see faint editing marks around the waist. In other words, Victorian photo editing existed more than a century before Photoshop. So were Victorian women really walking around with impossibly tiny waists? A few certainly did. Women like Empress Sisi became famous because they were so unusual. But for most women, the secret was a combination of corsets, clever dress design, and sometimes even edited photographs. The famous Victorian hourglass was often as much about illusion as reality. That is why these images still surprise people today. They show us that beauty standards have always existed, and sometimes even history knew how to fake the perfect picture.